Hello, dear listeners. In today's episode, we're taking another journey back into the forgotten folds of history, searching for the quiet moments that shaped the world. Whether you're cozy in bed or listening with closed eyes, I'm glad you're spending this peaceful time here. Before we dive in, let me know where you're tuning in from by leaving a comment below. Are you just waking up or about to drift off? If you find yourself enjoying these calm passages through time, please consider subscribing. And of course, like this video if you like it. There are many more nights like this ahead. What I'm about to reveal will shatter everything you thought you knew about Victorian respectability. Behind the pristine image of proper ladies managing their households and attending tea parties, an epidemic was quietly claiming lives across drawing rooms throughout England and America. These women weren't criminals or outcasts. They were mothers, wives, daughters, and pillars of society who became unwitting victims of their era's most dangerous miracle cure. In this series, I'm going to take you deep into the hidden world of Victorian opium addiction, where the line between medicine and poison blurred beyond recognition. We'll uncover the heartbreaking stories of real women whose names were whispered in hushed tones, and whose mysterious deaths were explained away as nervous conditions or weak constitutions. But first, let me show you just how devastating this silent epidemic truly was. Meet Charlotte Winslow, a woman whose story would become tragically common throughout the Victorian era. In 1853, Charlotte was everything society expected of a proper lady. She managed her husband's household in Boston with military precision, raised 3 children with unwavering devotion, and never missed a single charitable function. But behind closed doors, Charlotte was fighting a battle that would ultimately claim her life. It started innocently enough. After the difficult birth of her youngest daughter, Charlotte's physician prescribed laudanum for what he called her nervous exhaustion. Just a few drops in water, morning and evening, to calm her spirits and restore her strength. The amber liquid tasted bitter, but within minutes of taking it, Charlotte felt a warmth spread through her chest, washing away not just her physical pain, but every worry that had been gnawing at her mind. What Charlotte didn't know was that she had just taken her first dose of liquid opium, a substance so powerfully addictive that it would soon control every aspect of her existence. Within weeks, those prescribed doses no longer provided the same relief. Charlotte found herself taking the medicine 3 times a day, then 4, then whenever the familiar ache of withdrawal began to creep into her bones. The truly insidious part of this tragedy was how completely normalised laudanum had become in Victorian society. Walk into any apothecary shop in London or New York, and you'd find dozens of patent medicines containing opium. Godfrey's cordial for teething babies, Dover's powder for headaches, Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup for everything from menstrual cramps to melancholy. These weren't hidden in back rooms or sold by shadowy dealers. They were displayed proudly on shop counters, advertised in respectable newspapers, and recommended by family physicians. For Victorian women, laudanum wasn't just medicine, it was salvation. In an era when women had virtually no control over their bodies or their lives, when they were expected to endure childbirth without complaint, manage households without help, and suppress every emotion except gentle contentment, laudanum offered something precious: escape. Just a few drops could transform a day of endless domestic duties into something bearable. It could quiet the screaming of colicky babies, ease the pain of another difficult pregnancy, and provide a brief respite from the crushing weight of societal expectations. But this escape came at a price that most women didn't discover until it was far too late. The same qualities that made laudanum so appealing also made it devastatingly addictive. The opium didn't just relieve pain, it rewired the brain's chemistry, creating a physical dependence that grew stronger with every dose. Women who had started taking laudanum for legitimate medical reasons soon found themselves unable to function without it. Consider the case of Margaret Thornfield, a minister's wife in rural Yorkshire. Margaret began taking laudanum after developing what her doctor called neuralgia, a catch-all term for unexplained pain that Victorian physicians often used when they couldn't identify a specific ailment. The medicine worked wonderfully at first. Margaret's mysterious aches disappeared, and she felt more energetic and capable than she had in years. She threw herself into her duties as a pastor's wife with renewed vigour, organising charity drives and visiting the sick with tireless enthusiasm. But as months passed, Margaret noticed troubling changes. The periods between doses became increasingly difficult to endure. She would wake in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, her heart racing with inexplicable panic. During the day, she found herself watching the clock obsessively, counting the hours until she could take her next dose. When she tried to reduce the amount, as her conscience occasionally demanded, she was struck by symptoms so severe she thought she was dying. Her hands would shake uncontrollably, her stomach would twist with nausea, and waves of despair would wash over her with such intensity that she could barely leave her bedroom. Margaret's husband, a kind but naive man who trusted completely in his wife's virtue and his physician's wisdom, never suspected that his wife's medicine was slowly destroying her. Like most people of his era, he believed that addiction was a moral failing that afflicted only the weak-willed and degenerate. The idea that his pious, devoted wife could become dependent on her prescribed medicine was simply unthinkable. This blindness to the reality of laudanum addiction wasn't unique to Margaret's husband. Victorian society had created an elaborate fiction around opium use that allowed respectable people to maintain their denial, even as the evidence mounted around them. When women began taking increasingly large doses of their medicines, it was attributed to worsening health conditions that required stronger treatment. When they became withdrawn and listless, it was blamed on feminine weakness or nervous disorders. When they died, suddenly and mysteriously, it was explained as heart failure or brain fever. The truth was far more sinister. These women weren't succumbing to mysterious illnesses, they were overdosing on opium, sometimes accidentally, as their tolerance increased and they lost track of how much they had taken, and sometimes deliberately, as the weight of their addiction became unbearable. But because laudanum deaths often mimicked natural causes, and because families were desperate to protect their reputations, the true scope of the epidemic remained hidden. Victorian medical knowledge of addiction was primitive at best. Doctors understood that opium could be habit-forming, but they vastly underestimated its power and assumed that respectable people would naturally limit their use through moral restraint. They failed to recognize that physical dependence could overcome even the strongest willpower, and they had no effective treatments for withdrawal. When patients complained of symptoms after reducing their laudanum dose, doctors often interpreted this as evidence that they still needed the medicine, inadvertently encouraging continued use. The isolation of Victorian women made the problem even worse. Unlike men who might encounter other opium users in smoking dens or through social networks, women took their laudanum in the privacy of their homes, often unaware that they weren't alone in their struggle. They had no way to compare their experiences or seek help from others who understood their predicament. Each woman believed her growing dependence was a personal failing, a secret shame that must be hidden at all costs. This shame was compounded by the era's rigid gender expectations. Victorian women were supposed to be moral guardians, pure and self-controlled beings who elevated their families through their virtue. The idea that they might be unable to control their use of medicine contradicted everything society believed about feminine nature. Women who recognized their dependence faced an impossible choice: admit their problem and risk social disgrace, or continue using laudanum and hope they could somehow regain control before it was too late. Most chose to continue in silence, creating elaborate deceptions to hide their increasing consumption. They would visit multiple apothecary shops to avoid suspicion, claim to be buying medicine for sick relatives, or send servants on errands to purchase laudanum from shops across town. Some became expert at diluting their husband's brandy with laudanum, creating a mixture that could be consumed openly without raising questions. Others hid bottles throughout their homes, ensuring they would never be caught without access to their medicine. The financial cost of maintaining a laudanum habit could be devastating. As tolerance increased, women needed larger and more frequent doses to achieve the same effect. What had started as a few pennies worth of medicine per week could eventually consume a significant portion of the household budget. Women would sell jewelry, pawn household items, or find creative ways to skim money from their domestic allowances to fund their purchases. Some even resorted to theft, taking coins from their husbands' pockets or their children's piggy banks when desperation overwhelmed their moral constraints. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of the laudanum epidemic was how it robbed women of their relationships with their children. Mothers who had once been attentive and nurturing became distant and unpredictable under the influence of opium. They might be unnaturally cheerful and energetic shortly after taking their medicine, then irritable and withdrawn as the effects wore off. Children learn to read these mood cycles, approaching their mothers carefully during the good periods and avoiding them during the bad ones. Some mothers, recognizing the damage their addiction was causing, made desperate attempts to quit. They would pour their laudanum down the drain in moments of resolve, only to send servants rushing to the apothecary hours later when withdrawal symptoms became unbearable. Others tried to gradually reduce their doses, marking careful measurements on their bottles and setting strict schedules for consumption. But without medical support or understanding, these efforts almost invariably failed. The medical establishment's ignorance about addiction treatment meant that women who did seek help often received advice that made their situations worse. Doctors might recommend switching to different opium preparations, believing that variety would somehow reduce dependence. They prescribed additional drugs, like alcohol or chloral hydrate, to manage withdrawal symptoms, often creating new addictions alongside the original problem. Some physicians recommended complete rest cures, isolating women in private sanatoriums, where they were given even more laudanum to keep them calm and compliant. The desperation of these women manifested in ways that would shock modern sensibilities. Eleanor Hartwell, wife of a prominent London banker, began crushing her laudanum tablets and mixing them with her morning tea when liquid preparations no longer satisfied her cravings. She would sit at her mahogany breakfast table, surrounded by fine china and fresh flowers, consuming what amounted to lethal doses of opium while discussing the weather with her unsuspecting husband. Eleanor's transformation was gradual but unmistakable to those who knew how to look. Her once rosy complexion became pale and waxy. Her eyes took on a glassy, distant quality, and her movements became languid and dreamlike. She would nod off during afternoon visits, her embroidery falling from limp fingers as she drifted into opium-induced stupors. When questioned about her health, she would smile serenely and speak of feeling wonderfully peaceful, as if she had discovered some secret to contentment that others couldn't understand. The servants in these grand households often became unwitting accomplices in their mistress's addictions. Mary O'Brien, Eleanor's lady's maid, later recalled how she was sent on increasingly frequent errands to different chemist shops across London. Mrs. Hartwell would claim she needed medicine for various ailments, a headache remedy for the cook, stomach soothers for visiting relatives, sleeping draughts for her nervous sister. Mary never questioned these requests, because questioning one's employer simply wasn't done. And besides, all the medicines seemed perfectly legitimate. What Mary didn't realise was that she was participating in an elaborate shell game designed to hide the true extent of Eleanor's consumption. By the height of her addiction, Eleanor was taking laudanum every 2 hours around the clock. She kept bottles hidden in her jewellery box, behind books in the library, even sewn into the lining of her winter coat. The woman who had once prided herself on running an impeccable household could no longer remember whether she had given instructions to the cook or paid the weekly bills. The social calendar that had once defined Eleanor's existence became a minefield of potential exposure. She would accept invitations to tea parties and charity events, then spend agonizing hours calculating when she could take her medicine without being observed. Sometimes she would excuse herself multiple times during a single afternoon visit, claiming feminine indisposition while she retreated to consume laudanum in the host's powder room. Other times she would arrive at social gatherings already heavily medicated, speaking too slowly and smiling too broadly while her friends exchanged worried glances. Victorian etiquette provided perfect cover for these behaviours, because polite society had developed elaborate codes for ignoring uncomfortable truths. When Eleanor began missing important social events or arriving in obviously altered states, her friends simply stopped mentioning it. They would speak around her condition, referring to her delicate constitution or her ongoing treatment for nervous exhaustion. This conspiracy of silence allowed the addiction to progress unchecked, while maintaining the fiction that everything was perfectly normal. The physical deterioration of laudanum addicts followed a predictable pattern that doctors of the era either failed to recognize or chose to ignore. Women would lose significant amounts of weight as the opium suppressed their appetites, but this was often praised as fashionable thinness rather than recognized as a symptom of illness. Their skin would take on a yellowish pallor, their teeth would begin to decay from the constant presence of sugar-laden patent medicines, and their hair would become brittle and lifeless. Yet these changes were often attributed to the natural effects of aging or the stresses of domestic life. Perhaps most tragically, the cognitive effects of chronic laudanum use robbed these women of their mental acuity just when they needed it most to recognize their predicament. The same drug that had initially sharpened their focus and elevated their mood began to cloud their judgment and impair their memory. They would forget conversations they had just finished, lose track of time for hours at a stretch, and make increasingly poor decisions about their medicine consumption. Victoria Ashworth, a clergyman's daughter from Bath, exemplified this tragic decline. Once known for her sharp wit and extensive knowledge of literature, Victoria began experiencing what she described as mental fog after months of laudanum use. She would start reading a book only to discover she had already read the same chapter 3 times without remembering it. During conversations, she would lose her train of thought mid-sentence, staring blankly at her companions while struggling to remember what she had been saying. Victoria's family attributed these changes to the natural progression of whatever mysterious ailment required her constant medication. They encouraged her to rest more, to avoid taxing her delicate mind with challenging reading or complex thoughts. This well-meaning advice only accelerated her decline, as the isolation and mental inactivity made her more dependent on laudanum for stimulation and comfort. The relationship between laudanum addiction and Victorian marriage patterns created additional layers of tragedy. Wives were expected to be cheerful, compliant, and sexually available to their husbands, regardless of their own feelings or physical state. Laudanum provided a chemical solution to this impossible expectation, allowing women to perform their marital duties while feeling emotionally detached from the experience. Some women began taking extra doses before intimate encounters, using opium to numb themselves to unwanted sexual contact. This use of laudanum as a coping mechanism for marital rape, though never acknowledged or discussed openly, became disturbingly common among Victorian women. The drug allowed them to dissociate from traumatic experiences while maintaining the appearance of wifely compliance. Husbands often interpreted their wives' passivity as contentment, never recognizing that they were essentially assaulting unconscious women. The pregnancy experiences of laudanum-addicted women were particularly horrific. Opium crosses the placental barrier readily, meaning that unborn children were exposed to the drug throughout their development. Babies born to addicted mothers often suffered from what doctors described as nervous conditions, or failure to thrive. Not understanding that these infants were experiencing withdrawal from drugs they had never consciously consumed, doctors would sometimes prescribe even more opium. Sarah Peaton, a merchant's wife in Manchester, gave birth to 4 children during her years of laudanum addiction. Each pregnancy became progressively more difficult as her tolerance increased and her health deteriorated. Her first child, conceived before her addiction began, was healthy and robust, but her subsequent children were born small and sickly, prone to crying fits and digestive problems that no amount of care seemed to cure. Sarah, desperate to soothe her suffering infants, would sometimes give them tiny doses of her own medicine, unknowingly perpetuating the cycle of addiction into the next generation. The pattern of infant laudanum use was so common that entire generations of Victorian children were exposed to opium from birth. Patent medicines specifically marketed for babies contained substantial amounts of the drug, and mothers routinely dosed fussy infants to keep them quiet and compliant. The most popular of these pediatric preparations was Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, which contained enough morphine to sedate a grown man. Advertisements for the product featured angelic children sleeping peacefully while their grateful mothers looked on with satisfaction. What the advertisements didn't mention was that babies given regular doses of these soothing syrups often died in their sleep, victims of respiratory depression caused by opiate overdose. As tolerance levels rose, some women began experimenting with more concentrated forms of opium. They would purchase raw opium from sailors returning from the East Indies, or seek out Chinese immigrants who could provide stronger preparations. These ventures into opium dens and foreign communities represented dramatic departures from Victorian respectability, but desperation had long since overcome social constraints. The opium dens of London's East End became unlikely refuges for upper-class women whose prescriptions no longer provided adequate relief. These establishments, originally serving Chinese workers and sailors, began catering to a surprising clientele of well-dressed ladies who arrived in closed carriages after dark. Elizabeth Morrison, daughter of a prominent judge, began frequenting such establishments in 1867 after her physician refused to increase her laudanum prescription. Disguised in plain clothing and accompanied by her most trusted servant, Elizabeth would slip through the back entrances of Limehouse opium houses, seeking the pure drug that her refined medicines could no longer provide. She would lie on silk cushions beside Chinese labourers and foreign seamen, all boundaries of class and race dissolved in their shared pursuit of opium dreams. These expeditions became increasingly dangerous as Elizabeth's addiction progressed. The concentrated opium available in the dens was far more potent than anything she had experienced through medical channels, and her tolerance calculations proved fatally inaccurate. On a fog-shrouded evening in November, Elizabeth consumed what she thought was her usual dose, only to slip into a coma from which she never awakened. Her body was discovered the next morning by her frantic servant, but the official cause of death was listed as heart failure to spare her family's reputation. The cover-ups surrounding laudanum deaths became an art form among Victorian families desperate to protect their social standing. Physicians were often complicit in these deceptions, understanding that accurate death certificates would destroy entire family legacies. They would examine obviously overdosed bodies and certify deaths as resulting from consumption, brain fever, or sudden cardiac arrest. Funeral services would emphasize the deceased's virtue and piety, with no mention of the bottles of laudanum found clutched in their lifeless hands. The elaborate funeral of Elizabeth Morrison became a template for how Victorian society processed these tragic deaths. Her father, Judge Morrison, delivered a moving eulogy about his daughter's delicate constitution and her brave struggle against nervous exhaustion. The mourners, dressed in their finest black silk, nodded solemnly as he spoke of Elizabeth's charitable works and gentle nature. None of them mentioned the empty laudanum bottles found throughout her bedroom, or the suspicious circumstances of her death in London's East End. This conspiracy of silence extended far beyond individual families. Newspapers of the era developed their own coded language for reporting laudanum deaths. They would describe women as succumbing to prolonged illnesses born with Christian fortitude, or nervous disorders, carefully avoiding any mention of the opium that had actually killed them. Obituaries praised the deceased's patience in bearing their suffering, their devotion to family, and their gracious acceptance of God's will. The true cause of their agony remained hidden beneath layers of euphemism and social propriety. Dr. William Hartley, a London physician who treated dozens of laudanum-addicted women during his career, kept private journals that revealed the staggering scope of the epidemic. His notes, discovered decades later, documented case after case of respectable women who had lost control of their medicine consumption. He wrote of Mrs. Catherine Wells, a banker's wife, who was taking 40 grains of laudanum daily by the time she sought his help. To put this in perspective, 2 grains was considered a therapeutic dose for severe pain. Catherine was consuming 20 times the recommended amount just to feel normal. Dr. Hartley's attempts to help these women were hampered by both medical ignorance and social constraints. He couldn't hospitalize respectable ladies alongside charity cases and criminals, yet treating them at home meant they retained access to the very substances destroying them. His suggested treatment plans read like exercises in futility, gradual reduction schedules that patients couldn't follow, moral lectures about willpower that ignored the physical reality of addiction, and recommendations for travel to distant climates, where patients simply found new sources for their drugs. The international nature of the opium trade meant that Victorian women could feed their addictions almost anywhere in the civilized world. Agnes Whitmore, fleeing her husband's growing suspicions about her laudanum use, accompanied her sister on an extended tour of European spas. She discovered that German apothecaries sold even stronger opium preparations than their English counterparts, and that Swiss sanitariums would provide unlimited quantities of the drug to wealthy patients seeking treatment for nervous conditions. Agnes spent 6 months moving from spa to spa, always claiming to need stronger medicine for her worsening condition. She would arrive at each new establishment appearing wan and suffering dramatically, describing symptoms that any physician would recognize as requiring opiate treatment. The European medical community, even more deferential to wealthy English ladies than their domestic counterparts, readily prescribed whatever Agnes requested, but the constant travel and increasing drug consumption began taking a visible toll. Agnes's letters home, initially cheerful accounts of scenic mountain views and therapeutic treatments, became increasingly erratic and confused. She would write the same news multiple times in a single letter, forget important family events, and describe conversations with people who didn't exist. Her handwriting, once elegant and precise, became shaky and barely legible. When Agnes finally returned to England, her transformation shocked even those who had known about her laudanum use. She appeared to have aged decades during her months abroad, her face gaunt and her movements unsteady. The religious community's response to the laudanum epidemic revealed deep contradictions within Victorian moral frameworks. While churches preached against the evils of alcohol and tobacco, they remained largely silent about patent medicines that were destroying their female parishioners. This selective blindness reflected both genuine ignorance about addiction and deliberate avoidance of issues that might challenge comfortable assumptions about feminine virtue. Reverend William Hartwell faced this moral dilemma directly when his own wife, Margaret, began exhibiting obvious signs of laudanum dependence. Margaret had started taking Doctor, Morrison's nerve tonic, after the birth of their youngest child, claiming it helped her maintain the energy needed for her extensive church duties. But Reverend Hartwell gradually noticed that his wife's periods of charitable enthusiasm alternated with episodes of withdrawn lethargy that seemed to coincide with her medicine schedule. As a man of God, Reverend Hartwell believed that addiction was fundamentally a spiritual failing that could be overcome through prayer and moral discipline. He spent hours counseling his wife about the importance of self-control and the dangers of relying on earthly substances rather than divine strength. But his theological approach to what was actually a medical condition only increased Margaret's shame and desperation. Margaret began hiding her medicine consumption from her husband, taking doses in the church vestry before services and keeping bottles concealed in her Bible case during pastoral visits. The secrecy required to maintain her addiction while fulfilling her role as a minister's wife created additional psychological pressure that accelerated her decline. When Margaret finally collapsed during a women's prayer meeting, convulsing and foaming at the mouth in front of the entire congregation, Reverend Hartwell was forced to confront the reality of his wife's condition. But even then, he interpreted her overdose as a spiritual crisis rather than a medical emergency, calling for prayer circles and fasting rather than medical intervention. Margaret survived that particular episode, but her public collapse had shattered the carefully maintained fiction of her virtue and piety. Congregation members began whispering about the minister's wife who had lost control of herself during worship, and several families started attending other churches to avoid the embarrassment of association with scandal. The religious community's inability to address addiction honestly forced many suffering women to choose between their faith and their health. They could confess their struggles and face condemnation as moral failures, or they could maintain their addictions in secret while participating in religious activities that emphasized the very self-control they had lost. Some women found refuge in religious communities that took more compassionate approaches to human weakness. The Society of Friends, known as Quakers, developed an early understanding of addiction as a medical rather than moral problem, offering support and treatment rather than judgment. But these progressive religious groups represented small minorities within predominantly punitive theological frameworks. The economic pressures created by laudanum addiction often forced women into increasingly desperate measures to fund their drug purchases. As tolerance levels rose and required doses became more expensive, many women found themselves consuming significant portions of household budgets on medicine without their husband's knowledge. Constance Fairfax developed an elaborate system of financial deception to support her escalating laudanum consumption. She would purchase expensive household items from merchants who agreed to inflate their invoices, then return the goods for cash refunds that she used to buy medicine. She convinced tradespeople to bill her husband for services never rendered, keeping the payments for her own use. Most ingeniously, she began hosting charity fundraising events where she would skim donations intended for orphanages and hospitals. Constance's financial manipulations worked for nearly 2 years before her husband discovered discrepancies in their household accounts. By that time, she had embezzled hundreds of pounds from various sources, creating debts that threatened to destroy her family's social standing and financial security. When confronted with evidence of her theft, Constance broke down and confessed not only to the financial crimes, but to the laudanum addiction that had driven her to desperate measures. Her husband, a respected banker who had built his reputation on financial integrity, faced the impossible choice between exposing his wife's crimes and covering up behavior that violated everything he claimed to believe about honesty and moral responsibility. The family ultimately chose concealment over justice, repaying the stolen funds and fabricating explanations for the financial irregularities. Constance was quietly sent to a private sanatorium where she could receive treatment away from public scrutiny. But the shame and stress of her exposure triggered a final overdose that ended her life within weeks of her admission. The pattern of financial crime driven by laudanum addiction was far more common than Victorian society ever acknowledged. Women who had never contemplated dishonesty found themselves stealing from their children's education funds, pawning family heirlooms, and manipulating household accounts to support drug habits they couldn't control. The shame associated with these crimes was often worse than the physical effects of the addiction itself. The domestic service industry became another hidden casualty of the laudanum epidemic, as household staff found themselves managing employers whose drug use created impossible working conditions. Servants were expected to maintain normal household routines while their mistresses existed in varying states of opiate intoxication, creating daily crises that required constant improvisation and discretion. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, head housekeeper for the prominent Blackwood family, developed an intimate understanding of laudanum addiction through years of managing Lady Blackwood's increasingly erratic behaviour. Eleanor learned to recognise the signs that indicated when her mistress had taken too much medicine, when she needed assistance walking without falling, and when she should be left alone to avoid triggering paranoid episodes. The moral burden placed on servants like Eleanor was enormous and largely unacknowledged. They were required to enable their employers' addictions through purchasing medicines, concealing evidence of drug use from other family members, and maintaining household functions when their mistresses were too intoxicated to provide direction. Yet they were also expected to maintain absolute loyalty and discretion, never discussing their employers' conditions with anyone outside the household. Eleanor's detailed diaries, discovered decades after her death, provided unprecedented insight into the daily reality of living with laudanum addiction. She described mornings when Lady Blackwood would be found unconscious in her sitting room, afternoons when she would mistake servants for deceased relatives, and evenings when she would become convinced that intruders were hiding throughout the house. The physical dangers posed by heavily medicated employers created constant anxiety for household staff, who understood they could be blamed for any accidents or incidents that occurred under their watch. The children of laudanum-addicted mothers developed survival strategies that would shape their approach to relationships and authority for the rest of their lives. They learned to function as amateur physicians, recognizing the difference between their mother's various states of intoxication and understanding when adult intervention might be necessary to prevent medical emergencies. Young Timothy Ashworth became expert at managing his mother's laudanum addiction by age 10, having learned through painful experience that his survival depended on accurately reading her condition and responding appropriately. When his mother had taken too much medicine, Timothy would help her to bed and monitor her breathing until the danger passed. When she was experiencing withdrawal, he would bring her tea and remain nearby to provide comfort during the worst symptoms. Timothy's childhood responsibilities included tasks that no child should have been asked to perform. He learned to forge his mother's handwriting to write excuses for missed social obligations, to lie convincingly to visitors about his mother's whereabouts, and to manage household finances when his mother was too impaired to handle money responsibly. Most tragically, he became skilled at hiding evidence of his mother's condition from his father, understanding instinctively that family stability depended on maintaining elaborate deceptions. The hypervigilance required for these responsibilities created lasting psychological changes that affected Timothy's development well into adulthood. He became unable to relax completely, always scanning his environment for signs of crisis or danger. He developed an exaggerated sense of responsibility for other people's emotional states, believing that he could prevent disasters through careful attention and appropriate intervention. The tragedy of laudanum addiction reached its darkest depths when examining the pharmaceutical industry's deliberate targeting of pregnant women and new mothers. Companies like Bayer and Park Davis developed specific marketing campaigns that portrayed opium-based medicines as essential for maternal health. Claiming that expectant mothers who didn't use these preparations were endangering both themselves and their unborn children, Dr. Samuel Richardson's maternal cordial promised to ensure easy deliveries and healthy babies, while Mrs. Hartwell's nursing mother's friend guaranteed abundant milk production and calm dispositions. These products contained astronomical amounts of opium, often exceeding the concentrations found in medicines marketed to the general population. The manufacturers understood that pregnancy and childbirth created captive markets of women desperate for relief from physical and emotional suffering. Helena Blackwood discovered this truth during her fourth pregnancy in 1862. After 3 difficult births that had left her weakened and anxious, Helena's physician recommended Dr. Richardson's preparation to ensure a smoother delivery. The medicine seemed miraculous during her pregnancy, eliminating the nausea and emotional volatility that had plagued her previous experiences. Helena felt serene and confident, convinced that she had finally found the secret to comfortable motherhood. But when Helena's daughter was born, the infant exhibited strange behaviours that no one could explain. Little Margaret would scream for hours without apparent cause, her tiny body rigid with tension that nothing seemed to soothe. She refused to nurse properly, turning away from her mother's breast with what appeared to be distress. Most troubling of all, the baby seemed to experience episodes where she would shake uncontrollably, her face contorting as if in pain. The family physician attributed these symptoms to a nervous temperament inherited from Helena's delicate constitution. He recommended continuing the maternal cordial throughout the nursing period to ensure that Helena's milk would carry calming properties to her agitated infant. What he didn't understand was that baby Margaret was experiencing withdrawal from opium she had received through the placenta, and that continuing Helena's medication would only perpetuate the infant's addiction through breast milk. This tragic cycle repeated itself in nurseries across the civilized world, as entire families became unknowingly dependent on opium. Mothers would dose themselves to cope with the demands of childcare, inadvertently drugging their nursing infants. When these babies became fussy or difficult, mothers would increase their own medication, or begin giving the children direct doses of patent medicines specifically marketed for infant use. The international trade networks that supplied opium to Victorian consumers created opportunities for particularly unscrupulous operators to exploit addicted women. Smugglers and black market dealers recognized that wealthy ladies represented lucrative customers who would pay premium prices for reliable supplies of high-quality drugs. Captain James Morrison, a former East India Company officer, established a sophisticated distribution network that supplied laudanum to upper-class women throughout London and the surrounding counties. Morrison's operation was disguised as a legitimate import business, dealing in exotic spices and medicinal herbs, but his real profits came from the pure opium he smuggled in specially designed containers that escaped customs inspection. Morrison's customers included the wives of members of Parliament, prominent businessmen, and high-ranking military officers. He maintained detailed records of their purchases, using this information both to track their escalating consumption and to ensure their continued silence about his illegal activities. Women who attempted to reduce their purchases or seek alternative suppliers would receive anonymous letters, reminding them of the social consequences that would follow if their addiction became public knowledge. The blackmail aspect of Morrison's business model reflected the vulnerability of laudanum-addicted women to criminal exploitation. Their desperate need for reliable drug supplies, combined with their terror of social exposure, made them perfect victims for unscrupulous dealers who understood how to leverage shame and dependence for profit. Lady Margaret Ashworth became trapped in Morrison's web when her usual sources of laudanum proved inadequate for her escalating needs. Morrison promised to provide stronger preparations at reasonable prices, but gradually increased his charges while reducing the quality of his products. When Margaret protested, Morrison threatened to inform her husband about her purchases unless she agreed to recruit other customers from her social circle. Margaret found herself acting as Morrison's agent, introducing other addicted women to his services while receiving free supplies for her own use. The moral degradation of becoming a drug dealer while maintaining her facade as a respectable society matron accelerated Margaret's psychological deterioration and deepened her self-loathing. The Lord Epidemic stands as a stark reminder that progress without compassion leads only to elegant destruction, and that the most dangerous poisons often come wrapped in the most beautiful packages. Hello and welcome. Tonight we're stepping into a time where being a queen meant wearing 10 pounds of brocade while silently enduring political chess matches where you were often the piece, not the player. Welcome to medieval royalty, where your crown is heavy, your smile is rehearsed. And yes, you probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. I love knowing who's on the other side of this journey. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're 13, maybe 14, and someone just told you you're getting married. You're a noble girl, maybe a princess, maybe the daughter of a minor king, and you're about to become a medieval queen. Romantic, right? No. This isn't love, it's politics through and through. Your future husband is chosen for what he can offer your father. Land, troops, a treaty, or maybe it's just an end to a blood feud that's been going on longer than you've been alive. Your opinion isn't just not required, it's not even considered. If you protest too much, you risk dishonouring your family, and you know how that ends. Spoiler, not well. You're packed off from your home with a procession of ox-drawn carts, dowry chests, and worried ladies-in-waiting who've been assigned to babysit you until the grave. Or worse, until your new court decides to swap them out for spies. Maybe you've met the king once, maybe not. Doesn't matter. You'll meet him again on your wedding day, under a canopy of incense and chanting monks in front of a crowd of strangers who can't wait to see if you cry. And you probably will, because this man isn't some dashing fairy tale prince. He's 35, grizzled from wars, maybe still married to someone else who's been conveniently locked in a convent. Or worse. Or he's a boy your age with just as little power and a court full of venomous old nobles using you both like dolls in a shadow play. Historically, this wasn't rare. Eleanor of Aquitaine was married to Louis VII of France at 15. She became Queen of France basically overnight. Her job, be beautiful, obedient, and give France an heir, in that exact order. Not that she obeyed any of it, by the way, but we'll get to her legendary rebellion later. Right now, your life is all about silks, sapphires, and suffocating responsibility. And the wedding? Let's not sugarcoat it. You walk down the nave in a gown that weighs more than your horse, embroidered with gold thread and lined in squirrel fur. Sounds luxurious until you realise medieval laundry was, inconsistent. You may look radiant, but you smell like beeswax, old lavender, and stress sweat. Everyone's watching. Everyone! The bishop, your future in-laws, the servants pressed against the back walls trying to catch a glimpse of the spectacle. After the vows and rings, maybe a crown if they're feeling generous, you're escorted to a room where, depending on how invasive the customs are, your first night with your husband might be witnessed. No, not metaphorically. There's an entire tradition in some courts of having noble witnesses observe the newlyweds being put to bed, and even a sheet check the next morning to prove the marriage was consummated. Sleep well. The weirdest part? Your family likely trained you for this moment. You were raised in a chamber near the women's quarters, taught to read just enough to recite psalms, trained in needlework and decorum. But no one told you how terrifying it would be to kneel beside a man who can literally sentence people to death and call him your beloved lord. You might not speak his language. You probably don't know what kind of ruler he is. And you're expected to share his bed, smile like it's an honour, and get to work on making babies immediately. The power imbalance is staggering. But here's the twist. Queens weren't always powerless. In fact, many wielded incredible soft power through influence, alliances, and religious networks. But in the beginning, as a teenager dropped into a foreign court with different food, strange customs, and possibly even hostile nobility, you're more decorative than decisive. And yet, there's something surreal about it too. You're handed a crown, draped in cloaks worth more than a farm, and referred to as Her Grace by people who a week ago didn't know you existed. Your name changes, your coat of arms is redrawn, your past absorbed into your husband's world. This isn't just a marriage, it's a rebranding. You're not a daughter anymore, you're property, carefully placed atop the chessboard of European dynasties. Sometimes you're lucky, maybe your husband is kind, maybe the court respects you, maybe you learn to speak the language, make allies, and even carve out a space of your own. But don't get too comfortable. Your womb is now a matter of state. Your first duty is to have a male heir, preferably yesterday. Everything else is just window dressing. One fringe fact, in some royal weddings, the bride was literally carried to bed in a ritual known as the bedding ceremony, complete with songs, jokes, and awkward nudging from older relatives. The entire court treated it like the grand finale of a banquet. Imagine that as a teenager. Scholars still debate whether queens were pawns or players in this system. Some insist they were nothing more than vessels for heirs and peace treaties. Others argue that, despite restrictions, they often held real sway, especially if they managed to outlive their husbands or raise powerful sons. But tonight, you're just a young queen sitting on the edge of an unfamiliar bed, staring at tapestries you don't recognize, trying not to cry. And guess what? It only gets more complicated from here. The next morning, sunlight pours through stained glass windows you don't recognize, casting jewel-toned shadows across a stone floor that's colder than your nerves. You're awake far too early, muscles aching from the stiff ceremonial bedding, and already the court is bustling with whispered gossip and clipped footsteps. Why? Because today, your dowry becomes official. And let's be honest, no one in this castle cares more about you than they do about what you're worth. The dowry isn't just a polite thank you for taking you off your father's hands. It's a carefully calculated package of wealth, land, titles, and sometimes entire cities. You are a geopolitical transaction in pearls and velvet. It's possible your dowry was discussed for years before you even hit puberty. And now, with the marriage complete in the most awkward sense, the accounts are due. Clerks in itchy robes hunch over parchment, squabbling over exactly how many cows or manors equate to your hand in marriage. Some royal dowries were absolutely bonkers. Margaret of Denmark, for instance, brought the entire Orkney and Shetland Islands as part of hers. Imagine being so valuable that whole chunks of the North Sea came with your wedding vows. Meanwhile, in France or England, the dowry could include jewellery, spices, bolts of cloth, and thousands of gold coins. An actual line item might be 12 gowns embroidered with peacock feathers. And this stuff wasn't symbolic, it mattered. If the dowry fell short or was delayed, it could spark a war. Yep, a war over your missing embroidery thread. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Your value is now locked into this transaction. If your dowry was large and paid on time, congratulations, you're a prized political asset. If your father shortchanged your husband or reneged on promises, you're officially the most expensive disappointment in court. No pressure. But it gets trickier. The dowry isn't just a one-way street. There's also something called a dower, which is what your husband promises you in return, sort of a just in case he dies horribly in battle fund. It usually includes lands or income-producing properties that you'll inherit if you outlive him. Of course, whether you'll actually get those lands, well, that depends on your husband's mood, your popularity, and how many scheming in-laws want those assets for themselves. There's a fringe historical tidbit here that's kind of hilarious in a grim way. Some dowries were detailed down to the number of undergarments included. Like your father might have sent a full accounting of your trousseau, including how many linen shifts you brought and whether they were laced with gold thread. Some of these inventories have survived, and yes, they are weirdly specific. It's like reading a medieval fashion hall on parchment. The moment this transactional dance is complete, you officially belong to your husband's household. Your loyalties shift instantly, whether your heart has or not. And here's where it gets wildly awkward. Sometimes your father and husband hate each other, like deeply, but that doesn't matter anymore. You have to play nice, stay neutral, and most importantly, produce heirs. That's the only part of the deal that can't be written on parchment, so everyone's watching, waiting to see if you start showing signs of pregnancy. Fast. Oh, and don't expect privacy. Courtiers love to speculate. There's even a term for the flurry of surveillance queens faced after their weddings, the queen's bloom. Everyone wants to know when you'll bloom into motherhood. If you sneeze at breakfast or skip a wine goblet, whispers swirl like storm clouds. Some queens even faked early pregnancies to buy themselves time. Others miscarried in secret just to avoid court humiliation. You might try to focus on something less overwhelming, like settling into your new chambers. But even that's fraught. Your rooms are richly decorated, yes. Gilded wall panels, carved bedposts, rugs imported from Byzantium. But you're not alone in them, ever. Your ladies-in-waiting sleep nearby, servants shuffle in and out without knocking, and everything you say can and will be repeated. Still, you try to take control of what you can. Maybe you ask for your favourite psalter to be placed by your bedside. Maybe you commission a tapestry depicting your family crest to remind everyone, including yourself, where you came from. Little acts of self-assertion can go a long way, but you learn quickly. Don't overdo it. Being too proud is risky, especially if you're a foreign queen. People want you to be dignified, not defiant. Here's a scholarly debate that never quite gets settled. Were dowries empowering or dehumanizing? Some historians argue that because the dowry often came with land rights and income, it gave queens leverage within the royal household. Others counter that the whole system reduced women to literal price tags. You might find truth in both views. After all, you've got land and jewels, but also about as much autonomy as a decorative tablecloth. And then, of course, there's the awkward reality that you might be used again. If this marriage fails, say your husband dies suddenly or the alliance falls apart, you can be shipped off and married again, sometimes to someone even older or with fewer teeth. Your dowry might be renegotiated like a used goods exchange. The only thing more unstable than a political marriage is a second political marriage. Yay, but for now, you smile, sit upright at feasts, and pretend the sausages and honeyed almonds make it all feel normal. You clasp your goblet with elegant fingers and laugh politely at jokes you barely understand. Every gesture is watched, every misstep judged, every moment documented, sometimes literally in court records or chroniclers' scrolls, because you're no longer a person. You're a symbol, a treaty, a gilded link between two unstable kingdoms, and as exhausting as all that is, it's just the beginning. The first time you see the castle that's now your home, you expect something majestic. Maybe soaring towers, lush gardens, polished stone glowing in the afternoon light. What you get instead is something out of a chilly dream. Cold walls, grey skies, the air thick with damp moss and suspicion. The castle isn't built for comfort, it's built to withstand sieges, and now you live here. Congratulations, the arrival at court is theatre, make no mistake. The entire court turns out to greet you, though no one smiles too widely. Banners fly, trumpets blare, and children are scrubbed within an inch of their lives, just to stand in a muddy courtyard waving sprigs of rosemary. You ride in, stiff in the saddle, posture perfect. Your gown probably weighs 30 pounds, and underneath you're bracing against saddle sores and a cold wind that cuts through your silk-lined sleeves like a knife. But you can't flinch. Queens don't flinch. At the castle gates, your husband, or future husband, depending on how drawn out the wedding festivities are, greets you with ceremonial gestures, a kiss on the cheek, a quick touch of the hand if he's bold. Maybe he lifts your veil in front of the crowd, but you're already scanning the faces behind him. That's your real concern. Who's watching you with narrowed eyes? Who's smiling a little too much? Because the moment you cross that threshold, you're not just a guest. You're an intruder in someone else's world, The court is a hive of activity. Men in embroidered tunics bow stiffly, women in heavy wimples exchange glances, and servants skitter like mice behind the scenes. You're introduced with all the usual pomp. Her Royal Grace, Queen of such and such, Lady of this and that. It takes a full 2 minutes just to say your title, but every word reminds everyone exactly what price you fetched. That title is sewn into your identity now, whether you like it or not. Inside, the place smells like burning tallow, wet stone, and whatever the kitchen is stewing for tonight's feast, which could be anything from spiced rabbit to eel pie. The walls are lined with tapestries that look warm but don't really help against the draught. Your rooms, what they call the Queen's apartments, are secluded enough to keep you from the general rabble, but not so private that gossip can't sneak in through the floorboards. And here's the kicker. You don't know anyone. Not really? Maybe your new mother-in-law, if she's still alive and hasn't been packed off to a nunnery. Maybe your ladies-in-waiting, if your father managed to send a few you trust. But most of the people around you? Strangers. Ambitious, gossipy, power-sniffing strangers. And you're a teenage queen with no allies, no experience, and no idea which fork to use for salted trout. A real-life example of this cold welcome. Anne of Bohemia, when she arrived in England to marry King Richard II, people openly mocked her dowry, calling it worthless. She didn't even speak English. She was thrust into a world where her new subjects expected miracles and instant charm, and she delivered neither, at least not at first. It took years for her to win people over, and you will try too. You'll smile politely at barons who ogle you, ask careful questions about local saints, compliment tapestries even when they're ugly. Everything is performance, and the worst part, the performance never ends. You're not allowed to sulk or snap or ask to go home, not unless you want to start a diplomatic incident. Oh, and you quickly realize that every step you take is being watched. Not metaphorically, literally. There are eyes in the walls, not magic, just very bored, very nosy servants who report to higher-ranking courtiers, who in turn feed information to the king's advisors, and eventually to the king himself. Did the queen eat her figs at breakfast? Did she talk too long with the Spanish envoy? Did she wear blue on a feast day? All noted, all discussed in hushed tones over spiced wine. But let's zoom in on the servants for a moment, because this is where things get weird. Some are devoted, some resentful, and some are just there. One might be a peasant girl who's never left her village before being promoted to chambermaid. Another could be the bastard daughter of a noble family with nowhere else to go. And a few, full-on spies. Some sent by your own family, some by your enemies, and some just nosy opportunists with good ears and long memories. The fringe fact here, in some medieval courts, queens were expected to keep their own miniature household within the larger royal household. Think of it like a secret club with its own budget, hierarchy, and drama. You manage your own maids, scribes, cooks, and confessor. Sounds empowering, until you realize any one of them might betray you the moment it benefits someone higher up the chain. Meanwhile, your new subjects are watching too, and they have opinions. If you're from a foreign land, you're immediately suspected of trying to corrupt the court with foreign ideas, or worse, foreign fashions. They whisper that you bring omens, that your accent means your prayers don't count, that your foreign ways are a sign of secret sin. Even if you're kind and generous, rumours cling to you like damp wool. This brings us to a long-standing scholarly debate. Were foreign queens more vulnerable or more powerful because of their outsider status? Some say they had fewer political allies and were easy scapegoats. Others argue that their unique background gave them a rare independence from local factions. In your case, it just feels like being isolated in a room full of people who all know something you don't. But still, you settle in. You memorize names. You learn which corners of the castle stay warmest at night. You start eating like the locals, sort of. You practice curtsies in front of the looking-glass until your knees ache, and slowly, very slowly, the court begins to see you, not just as the new queen, but as their queen. Not that this makes things easier. In fact, it just means the real games are about to begin. Night falls heavy in the stone corridors of your new home, and while the day has been full of handshakes, veiled compliments, and trying not to trip over your own embroidery. Tonight is something else entirely. Tonight is about duty, or, depending on which court gossip you listen to, spectacle. You're expected to do more than share a bed. You're expected to seal the marriage in a way that leaves no doubt, no legal loopholes, and no "we'll wait and see." Tonight, you're expected to consummate your union, and in some medieval courts, that expectation doesn't stop at the bedroom door. You've heard the whispers, of course. Some kingdoms go all in on the witnessed bedding ceremony. A crowd escorts you and your husband to the marriage bed with jokes, songs, and awkward blessings. Think of it as a medieval conga line, except it ends with you being undressed by your ladies while everyone else stands around pretending not to stare. In some places, the bedding itself was attended, though mercifully not always literally witnessed. Instead, the next morning, sheets were displayed, or midwives and matrons might be called to check for certain, signs of activity. You lie in bed, heart-pounding, draped in linens that smell like damp rosewater, and centuries of awkward history. Your husband lies beside you, possibly more nervous than you are, though he'd rather be thrown to the wolves than admit it. Whether he's gentle or cold, or fumbling or practiced, you're still a teenager, and no amount of training or advice can prepare you for the reality of being expected to perform intimacy with someone who was a stranger last week. This is not a honeymoon. It's a civic ritual, and while it's cloaked in lace and candles, it's ultimately about succession and legitimacy, not your feelings. This is what queens were trained for, even if no one said it out loud. You may have spent years learning courtly manners, religious verses, how to direct a household, but all of it leads to this, making sure the marriage is binding and productive. It's a terrifyingly thin line between beloved queen and political failure. You wake up the next morning under that same weight. You're a wife now, a potential mother, a state investment that needs to yield results. And people start watching you differently. The same courtiers who nodded politely yesterday now glance at your stomach when you pass, eyes flicking down as if your womb might announce its intentions by breakfast. Your maids whisper more, the ladies-in-waiting act more possessive, and your husband, well, he's probably off hawking or hunting, because the deed is done, and his role, at least for now, is considered fulfilled. You might not even be the only woman in his life. Medieval kings were not known for monogamy. Some had official mistresses, others just a rotating list of favourites, many of whom lived under the same roof. In some courts, the queen was expected to tolerate it. Open jealousy was not elegant. You're meant to be serene, divine, and above it all, even if your heart's breaking or your blood's boiling. And yet, some queens navigated this chaos with surprising agency. Take Isabella of France, for instance. Married to England's Edward II, who famously preferred the company of a certain male favourite, Isabella endured years of being sidelined before eventually leading a rebellion against her husband. Yep, the Queen led an actual coup. So while the first night might feel like the beginning of a lifetime of submission, that's not always how the story ends. But in this moment, that feels very far away. The court isn't done with you yet. After the marriage comes the public confirmation of your new role. You might be paraded through the streets in a gilded carriage, petals thrown at your feet, people cheering as if you've already delivered twins and saved the kingdom from plague. It's all part of the illusion. Queens aren't just figureheads. They're symbols of divine blessing. Your beauty, your poise, your fertility, all seen as signs that God favours the realm. No pressure. A fringe fact worth noting. In some traditions, a special cake or spice bread was served the day after the wedding, and everyone would toast to your hypothetical future children. Sometimes there were even fertility symbols baked into the crust, because what's more charming than cutting into a cake and finding a little golden baby charm staring up at you? But don't be fooled. Under all this pomp lies a harsh truth. If you don't get pregnant quickly, or worse, if you miscarry, your popularity will nosedive. People will blame your body, your foreign blood, your sins, your lack of piety. Never mind that medieval medicine was basically guesswork with leeches. Never mind that men also contribute half of that equation. You are the queen, and therefore the breeding machine. The pressure is constant and deafening. There's a long-standing scholarly debate about how much say medieval queens had over their own marital beds. Some argue that queens could negotiate bedroom dynamics, especially if they were politically savvy or came from powerful families. Others believe queens were largely powerless, their consent a non-issue in legal and religious eyes. What we do know is that many queens found clever ways to control what they could: timing, influence over household staff, and eventually guidance over their children's futures. But at this stage, you're mostly along for the ride, so you do what you must. You perfect your smile. You begin keeping a private journal, perhaps, or whispering thoughts into the ears of trusted maids, though trust is always relative. You go to mass. You attend court. You send letters to your mother back home if the scribes allow it. You start planning for what comes next, not just pregnancy, but survival. And survival, you're starting to realize, means more than staying alive. It means staying useful, charming, obedient, fertile, unthreatening, but also clever, resilient, patient. You're walking a tightrope wrapped in gold thread, and every. Morning, as the bells toll across the grey courtyard and your reflection flickers in a polished copper mirror, you ask yourself quietly, how long can I keep this up? It starts with a flutter, just a whisper of nausea when you rise, a slight tightening in your chest when the morning porridge hits your stomach the wrong way. Your maid notices before you do, narrowing her eyes as she helps lace your gown a little looser. The word spreads faster than you'd think. The queen is changing. Couriers exchange looks. The cook starts preparing lighter foods. A physician is summoned without you even asking. No one says the word directly, not yet, but you already know what they're hoping for. You're pregnant. Maybe. And just like that, you're not just a wife anymore. You're the womb of the realm. You've gone from ornamental to essential. The queen's job, your job, is finally happening. And while on the surface there's joy, gifts, blessings, and ceremonial prayers, underneath it all is the sound of chairs being pulled closer to the throne. Because once you're carrying an heir, your power shifts just a little, but enough for people to start calculating how long they'll have to wait for a new king, or if you're really lucky, a queen mother. Pregnancy in medieval times is terrifying. There are no ultrasounds, no prenatal vitamins, no real understanding of germs or what a uterus actually looks like. You're not so much cared for as you are monitored, watched like a relic on the verge of cracking. The royal physicians poke and prod, feeling your pulse, measuring your belly with ribbons, muttering things in Latin while your ladies-in-waiting line up cloths soaked in lavender and rosemary. Some of the herbs help, some probably don't, some, if the dose is wrong, might even kill you. And yet, you go through the motions, trying to appear serene. You attend Mass every morning, nodding piously while the priest talks about the Virgin Mary and the miracle of life. That's the image they want from you. Holy Mother, chosen vessel, serene goddess of impending motherhood. But inside, you're a 17-year-old girl with lower back pain, a constant headache, and zero control over what's happening to your body. Every kick from inside your belly is both thrilling and terrifying. If it's a boy, you win the game. If it's a girl, you smile politely and pretend everyone's not secretly disappointed. And if the child is stillborn or you die in labour, well, then you'll be remembered in ballads as a tragic heroine, which is cold comfort, to be honest. By your 7th month, the palace begins to quiet down. Your husband grows more cautious. Visitors are shushed. Loud noises are forbidden near your chambers. The court is holding its collective breath. Midwives are brought in from far and wide, some traditional, some trained by monks, all quietly panicking beneath their calm smiles, because childbirth in the Middle Ages is a gamble with weighted dice. Even queens die screaming in childbed, probably especially queens. The pressure is higher, the gossip sharper, the risks enormous. And when the labour finally begins, the world shrinks. You're taken to a darkened room, windows covered, icons of saints propped up all around you. Candles flicker along the walls, shadows dancing like anxious angels. The room becomes what they call a lying-in chamber, sealed against bad spirits. It's hot, crowded, and thick with the smell of burning herbs and fear. You scream, of course you do. There's no pain relief, just grit and groan and chant and pray. The women around you, your ladies, the midwives, maybe even a few noble women, offer comfort, or at least try to. Some hold your hands, one might whisper a prayer in your ear over and over like a lullaby. But you're alone in this, really. Completely, utterly alone in your pain. Hours pass, maybe days. You lose track. The world becomes a blur of heat and agony and tightening pressure. You scream until your voice breaks. You pass out and come to. You think you hear someone say, "It's crowning," but it could just as easily be the last prayer you'll ever hear. And then, if you're lucky, a cry, a new voice, raw and angry, slicing through the candle smoke. A midwife lifts the child high, announces the sex with trembling reverence. "A boy," she says, or maybe a girl. And the court outside erupts accordingly. You don't even see the baby at first. Oh, you're too exhausted, too bloody, too shattered to sit up. Then someone presses the infant into your arms eventually, and for a second, a fleeting, golden, hallowed second, you feel joy. Pure, unfiltered joy. It's yours. This tiny, squirming person is yours. And then you remember, he doesn't really belong to you. He belongs to the kingdom. If it's a son, he's the heir, and your value skyrockets overnight. You're no longer just the queen, you're the mother of the future, a living insurance policy against succession wars. Your rooms fill with gifts, your name is sung in churches, and suddenly everyone wants your opinion on nursery arrangements, on treaties, on what colour robe the baby should wear for his first court appearance. If it's a girl, the congratulations are still there, but lighter, softer. A courtier might mention how daughters make wonderful bargaining chips for future marriages. Another might remind you that queens bear many children, and there's always next time. The fringe truth. Sometimes, if the queen gave birth to a boy, coins were minted within hours. Tiny, hastily stamped medallions that said, "This realm has an heir. All is well." If you gave birth to a girl, well, no coins. Maybe a feast if you were lucky. And here comes the scholarly debate. Did childbirth increase a queen's political power or trap her further? Some argue that motherhood granted queen's influence, control over the royal nursery, a seat at the regency table if the king died. Others point out that it made queens more vulnerable, exposed to dangerous childbirths over and over again, reduced to walking cradles whose usefulness hinged on the health of their offspring. The answer, as always, depends on who you were, where you ruled, and how lucky your body was. You're bundled up in clean linen now, propped on pillows, your skin still pale and waxy, but the baby is breathing. You're breathing. The bells are ringing across the city, the kingdom rejoices. And you close your eyes and try to forget that this is only the first round. You've survived childbirth. That alone makes you something of a miracle. Now, as the days blend into a haze of damp linen, soft lullabies and sharp pelvic pain, you begin to settle into your new role. Not just as queen, not just as wife, but as something far more exhausting. Royal Mother. And with that title comes another shift, one that has less to do with survival and more to do with presentation. You can barely sit upright, but already the court expects you to begin looking the part again. And looking the part, as it turns out, is a full-time job. Your wardrobe becomes a stage, and every layer you put on is political. Every colour, every hem, every jewel carries a message. I am regal. I am fertile. I am strong. But more than anything else, it screams, I am worth obeying. You're no longer dressing to impress a husband. You're dressing to remind the kingdom that you belong here. That you have produced proof of your power in the form of a living, breathing heir. You're not to be dismissed, ignored, or replaced. Not yet, anyway. In the royal wardrobe, there's no such thing as casual. There's only layers: chemise, surcoat, gown, overgown, cloak, silk, velvet, fur, embroidery so fine it looks like lace, stitched with real gold thread, jewels sewn directly into sleeves. You don't wear your wealth. You drag it behind you, sewn into the hem and clinging to your wrists. Your crown alone could buy a small town and still have change, left over for a cathedral bell. And yet, underneath it all, you itch. The brocade is stiff, the pearls rub your collarbone raw. Some of the fur lining smells like damp cellar, especially in winter when nothing dries properly. You long for soft linen shifts, for bare feet on warm stones, for a moment without corsetry and pins. But queens don't get comfort, they get presents. Now, here's the tricky bit. You don't actually choose your wardrobe, not entirely. A royal tailor does that, so does your chamberlain. And sometimes, just for fun, your mother-in-law weighs in. Your body is essentially on loan to the crown, and so is the fabric that wraps it. If a foreign ambassador visits, they'll expect you to wear a particular colour, perhaps blue to signify purity, or red to evoke power. If it's Easter, your garments will be stitched with lilies and crosses. If it's Advent, out comes the dark velvet and silver thread. Every season is a costume change. Historical tidbit: Queen Isabella of Castile's wardrobe accounts were meticulously kept, detailing every gown, every fur trim, every jewel. These records show how deeply intertwined royal fashion was with political messaging and national identity. So, as you stand there, weighted down by layers of silk and expectation, you understand that your appearance is a language in itself. It speaks of power, of tradition, of the continuation of a dynasty. And you, the young woman underneath it all, are merely the messenger. What do you think was the most challenging aspect of being a medieval queen?